without further ado, we're going to get started. So like I mentioned, on Monday, we announced a partnership with CHS. About 5 years ago or so, when Grand Farm was just getting off the ground, CHS was the first industry partner that came to the game and said, we want to be a part of this. We believe in the mission of Grand Farm, and we're so excited to continue that partnership and have David Black, the Executive Vice President, Enterprise Transformation and Chief Information Officer for CHS, which for those that don't know, and I'm assuming most of you know, they are a leading global agribusiness and the largest farmer-owned cooperative in the United States. So without further ado, I'll welcome up David Black.
Well, it's a real pleasure to be here with you. We, of course, at CHS are really excited to be both partners of the Cultivate session here today as well as the Grand Farm. Again, my name is David Black. I've been with CHS for about 9 years now. And my role at CHS really is around transformation, innovation, technology. Prior to CHS, I spent 22 years at a company called Monsanto doing much the same thing. So like many of you in the room, for me, for more than 30 years now, I've really been thinking about how we apply technology and innovation to the challenges of agriculture. Maybe I'll spend just a second and explain a little bit more of what CHS is, because I think it'll provide some context to kind of how I view the challenges of agriculture. So we are the nation's largest cooperative, Fortune 100 company, about $45 billion a year in revenue. And we have both energy and ag platforms. But our business model is really quite simple. So our business model is this. We help farmers with the inputs that they need to produce an acre of crops. We help them through the season to grow that acre of crops through crop inputs, through services. And then at the end of the season, we come along and we help farmers by purchasing the grain. Some of the grain we process ourselves through our own processing manufacturing facilities. And then some of the grain we ship, we export to buyers around the globe. So when I think about agriculture, I really do think about from the farm all the way to a global customer. And I think about agriculture really as a global supply chain. You know, I said I've been doing this for some 30 years, and I know I've been at conferences like this that might have been called a Precision Ag Conference, a conference that was very much focused on yield and getting the most productivity out of that acre and the most yield out of that acre to feed a hungry world, which is very noble and which is very much needed without a doubt. But I'd like to maybe challenge this room to think a bit more broadly about the challenges that we have in agriculture. And I'm going to talk about a couple that I see, a couple of trends in agriculture, what I'll call disruptions going on in agriculture that go beyond technology. I think all of us in the room can appreciate how technology will continue to help evolve agriculture, but also will disrupt what we do in agriculture. But I think there are a couple of other disruptions that I've really seen probably for the first time in my 30 years. One is around disruptions going on in our supply chains, and I'll talk a little bit about why and what's happening there. And then the second is this idea of sustainability. And actually the two sort of come together. So I just wanted to share a perspective on these disruptions that may help all of us in the room think about how we continue to innovate to solve challenges in agriculture. So let's talk about supply chain first. The trade of grain, the movement of grain around the globe has changed. It's changed in a way that I'm not certain will ever go back to the way it was before. And there are some reasons that's occurred. First, as many of you know, we had a war in Ukraine. We have a war in Ukraine. Ukraine was a significant contributor of grain to a global supply chain. While some production has come back online, it's not the way it was before, certainly. And where that grain flows and how that grain flows has left a gap in our global supply chain. So that's a challenge for us. The second is, and we know, and we've seen, and typically when I talk about sort of challenges related to how grain moves around the globe, oftentimes the story is demand in Asia. Protein demand in Asia, changing diets in Asia, and that's still there. So there's still a significant demand to feed growing populations in Asia. It's the second. The third really change that we're seeing is related to either weather, political. We don't necessarily always have reliable trade routes, and I'm talking specifically about the Panama Canal and I'm talking about Middle East trade routes, that are disrupted. So now the idea of those trade routes that you would think would be typical routes between Europe, North America, Asia, are changing. And delivery times can take 2 days extra, 3 days extra, 4 days extra, 5 days extra. What does that mean for quality? How do we measure quality? How do we use data? How do you use analytics? How do you think about that sort of disruptions going on? Another change in our global supply chains is Brazil. Brazil is clearly growing in terms of the production of agriculture, and there's some reasons for that, and I'll touch on a couple. But as an example, in 2023, Brazil exported more corn than the US. Brazil's making significant investments in infrastructure internally. The evolution of the use of technology and just the production, the yield production that's going on in Brazil continues to grow, but it's much needed. So I don't say this because it's not needed. I say this because, well, a couple of things. One, in the US, of course, we grow a crop in a summer season, by and large, a single crop, or a single season in the US, and a summer season in the Northern Hemisphere. Feeding a global world takes production year-round, not just in the summer season in North America. So we do rely, as we think about kind of a global supply chain, we rely a lot on South America as well. But here's something that's really interesting that's I see changing significantly, and I think it's on a path to continue to change. And that's the domestic crush, the domestic use of grain in the US. And it's really driven by the fact that energy and agriculture are coming together in a way that's likely never happened before. In fact, standing here in North Dakota, knowing that both energy and agriculture are two significant industries, it's really interesting to think about this room that we're in also sort of being a focal point for the way energy and agriculture can come together. And here's what I mean by that. Renewable diesel fuel. By and large, the most efficient way to create renewable diesel fuel is through soybean oil as a feedstock. So US soy crop is significantly moving to renewable diesel. This is really a West Coast play today. It's California, it's Oregon, it's Washington. It's legislated, it's compliance activity, there's incentives around it to create the economics for renewable diesel. But that's changed the way that we've exported soybeans in the US. There are other states like Minnesota, Illinois, New York that are also considering legislation, considering incentives to really push toward renewable diesel. If the state of New York follows a similar trend to the state of California in terms of renewable diesel, that would consume, on paper, all the soybeans produced in the US. So it would take all the soybeans produced in the US to supply renewable diesel to New York, California, and a few other states. That's a significant change. Another change that's sort of driven in the same space that we see going on around how grain is traded globally is this idea of sustainable aviation fuel. Now, it's probably a bit further out than renewable diesel. But if you think about sustainable aviation fuel, we've heard from Delta as an example that by the year 2030, they're expecting to have 50% of their fleet operating on sustainable aviation fuel, SAF. I really have no idea how they're going to get there by 2030. I mean, I truly don't. But they publicly made that statement. And one of the paths to sustainable aviation fuel is ethanol, and the ability to sequester CO2 off an ethanol facility to reduce the carbon intensity score. So if that pathway continues to grow, we see a world in which less corn will be exported and more corn will be used domestically. So it's really interesting that I think there's a challenge here to be solved in terms of the way grain is going to continue to move around the globe, and this idea of continued domestic crush, continued domestic manufacturing. So that's one trend. That's one trend, that's just this idea of the way global trade's going to occur. I think the other trend that I see that's truly a disruptor for agriculture is sustainability. And I know sustainability is a big word, and it's kind of easy to put everything into the sustainability space. But I think early on, we would think about, as it relates to agriculture, sustainability really being, continued use of the land in an efficient way, in a responsible way, which of course farmers have been doing for decades and decades. So this idea of sustainable ag is really nothing new, but it has a new dimension to it. And I think the new dimension that we see that really is a disruptor is this idea of compliance, this idea of being regulated in a different way. Some of it's in front of us now, some of it will be in front of us in the future, but let me explain maybe a couple of things that we see that are probably likely about the timing, how long it takes to get to this sort of sustainable kind of set of expectations, rather than if we're going to. So one, we recently saw the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, has a whole new set of rules around the way companies, public companies, are going to need to report on what they call non-financial information, essentially sustainable information. How do we report on the carbon intensity footprints, greenhouse gas, those sorts of things? It's going to be legislated. Now there's a stay that was going into effect in 2025. There's now a stay, but that stay really appears to be to help companies have the time to get ready for that, not whether or if that will happen. That's, of course, going to go through the whole supply chain and at some point impact producers as well. That's at a federal level. The state of California already has requirements in place. So if you're farming in California, there are already legislative requirements that are going to be expected to meet around the use of carbon and greenhouse gas. If you think on an international stage, we very much see it today. The EU has legislated this reporting against sustainability in a way that all companies globally are going to have to adapt to, and it already impacts our producers, at least producers we see in other countries. I'll give you an example of that. So in Brazil, this idea of deforestation is important. And if you think about the story I told you earlier, that Brazil continues to grow, but we need Brazil to grow as the US consumes more grain domestically. Deforestation in Brazil, you can't farm on deforested land, illegal deforested land. You farm on legal deforested land. If you want to take that grain into the European Union, it doesn't matter if it came on legally deforested land. The European Union says we won't accept grain on any land that's been deforested. Well, now what's the definition of deforestation? And if you think about extending that definition even to the US farmer, it gets a little gray. It gets a little gray in terms of what actually is deforestation. And are there some activities even a US farmer does that might be considered deforested? My point in that is only that sustainability, I think, certainly is an opportunity. It's an opportunity in terms of how farmers will think about the way that they can maybe commercialize value capture as things like, by and large, energy-led sustainability sort of lead the industry and in terms of where value is going to be captured or how incremental value may occur on the acre. But my story is it's more than just that. It really is this idea now of a need for innovation, a need for technology to not just understand what you're planting, how you're planting it, where you're planting it. So I do encourage all of us to think now about sort of this world in which we certainly want to continue to improve yield and we want to continue to improve production, but we need to do that in a way in which we understand how that's occurring. There's likely going to be opportunities and needs for innovation and technology to connect that information through a much broader supply chain. Think about the changes and the disruptions going on from a sustainability perspective, as well as the disruptions that are going to continue to go on in terms of just supply chains and how grain and how food moves across the U.S. So with that, I really just wanted to maybe start us off with kind of taking a step back and thinking about what we see, what I see going on in agriculture, how agriculture is going to continue to change, some of the disruptions coming at us, and how rooms like this, honestly, at the end of the day, will be a huge part of the solution. How innovation, how technology, how the use of information, how the use of how the use of analytics, how the use of automation, all those things will really come together to provide solutions, not just on the acre, but solutions broadly across an industry that's absolutely going to continue to need innovation and technology to solve our challenges both here and globally. Thank you for your time. Appreciate it.